Well, Sandon Capital's portfolio was up by more than 5% in October after fees and brokerage. The largest positive contributors, Nuix, Fleetwood and London-listed Spectra Systems. Sandon is inclined to invest in small caps and has activism at its core to help celebrate future generations' 10th anniversary. We caught up with Sandon's Gabriel Radzyminski, one of Future Gen's original managers, and began by asking about Sandon's investment strategy.
Look, I think quite a bit like Future Generation, we try and invest where we can make a difference. We're trying to identify companies that are undervalued, mispriced, where there's sometimes a problem, and then we approach it by looking and seeing, well, what can we do to change? Are there things that they could do or that we as shareholders could do that might improve the situation? And just like Future Gen, make a difference.
If activism is at the heart of your investment strategy, does that mean that it's confrontational, or how does this sort of process work when you're engaging with companies?
It depends. Sometimes it can be confrontational. The confrontational instances are where you're dealing with people who don't want to change for whatever reason. Often it comes down to conflicts of interest, and I don't mean bad, nefarious things, but just where, for example, someone might have personal ambitions where they want to have an opportunity to build a reputation for doing something fantastic. That doesn't always make sense for shareholders. Sometimes it's things that we do behind closed doors, but more often than not, the companies that we get involved with, we have to escalate such that it becomes a public engagement.
So a couple of the companies that we may be familiar with here, I know you've engaged with Magellan this year.
Yep.
And what was that fundamentally about?
Look, Magellan is a name that was known or is known to many, many people. And that's actually one of the reasons we invested. We believed that Magellan then, and even more so now, had a very strong franchise among investors, particularly retail and intermediate investors, people who go and see financial planners. And for many years, Magellan did a fantastic job. Come the GFC, come the COVID crisis, I mean, there's crises everywhere over a career as long as mine. But they fell on some tough times, but particularly issues to do with the founder. And we think that more than adversely negated the prospects for the business. And we started looking at Magellan last year and took the view that the damage was more than adequately reflected in the share price, and there was an opportunity to buy what we consider to be a very discounted, undervalued stock, where a few small changes could actually make a meaningful difference. Like a lot of things for us, the changes, typically we're looking for change at the top. And so we articulated some changes we felt that the company should make to its board, to its remuneration practices, and really to focus on their existing business, to focus on the bird in the hand, not the two in the bush. What happened was that we conducted a campaign in the lead up to their AGM. A lot of ingredients that made it high profile, not the least being that it was Magellan. There were critiques that we had about their remuneration programs or lack of a structured remuneration, which led to a pretty solid remuneration strike. That's where investors can send a pretty clear message to boards about how unhappy they are. And at around the same time, they made changes. New executive chairman came on board, Andrew Formica. And since then, and since that AGM, we've seen just a series of good moves that have de-risked and improved the value of Magellan.
So you think that this is a ship that's being turned around?
Oh, well on its way to turning. I think you'd have to say the jury is still out, but I think the deliberations are very close to an end. They've appointed a new CEO or new MD, soon to be appointed CEO, Sophia Armani, comes with a very, very strong pedigree. Andrew Formica, again, strong pedigree, well respected, well regarded in the funds management industry. And even with those two appointments and the new directors that were appointed with funds management experience, those addressed one of the criticisms that we had, which was that you had a board that didn't have a lot of funds management experience, except for being directors of Magellan, and a CEO who didn't have what we consider to be the requisite experience. So those changes have really made a big difference to the prospects for that business. And it's important to remember that Magellan, despite its enormous fall from grace, didn't actually do such a bad job for its investors, i.e. the investors in their managed fund products. Mm-hmm.
So I would think that your time frame has to be a bit longer, correct? Yep. What's the time frame that you're usually staying invested in these businesses?
Look, our starting point is usually 3 to 5 years minimum, and that's often to see change occur. We've held investments in our portfolios for 12, 13 years. And when I say held, not held them and traded them, but held and untraded. We don't tend to trade our positions. We see ourselves as buyers of businesses, not renters of pieces of paper. So in that sense, we have a very genuine long-term investment horizon of the companies that we invest in. Of course, if we invest and realise that things aren't going the way we want or we've made a mistake, we cut it. That's the benefit of being in a listed environment.
Yeah, and so Magellan is obviously a very well-known name. What does your investment universe look like? Is it big companies, or can it go down the spectrum if you're looking for value?
Look, it's predominantly smaller companies, and part of the reason we find more opportunities in small companies is, for us, there's a couple of things we're looking for. We're looking for the mispricing. We're looking for something that's undervalued. What we're also looking for is a plausible, at least in our minds, a plausible path to change. When you start looking at the very largest companies, say top 50, perhaps even top 100, what we find is that the ownership of those companies is far too diffuse. There's just too many people involved in ownership of those companies. And for us, what is most important in our engagements is not the board. Because typically we go to a board, we introduce ourselves, and for the most part they go, yeah, that's it. We know what we're doing, we don't need you to tell us anything. And we're not trying to tell anyone anything, we're trying to suggest different ways of looking at things. The bulk of our effort, the bulk of our focus is on other shareholders in the companies that we invest in, because if we can create a consensus amongst the shareholders, that's when you get change. Simply going to a board and making your case to the board doesn't really work.
So there's sort of a magic, special sauce. There's activism, but there's also value that needs to be evident. So are there pockets of value that you can identify in the Australian market right now? Or maybe how do you approach finding value in the market?
I think I can answer the second part of your question better than the first. Because we don't really tell people what we're looking at. For example, even on Friday, we put in an order to buy a decent chunk of a company that we're interested in. We'll find out hopefully by the end of today, possibly the end of the week if we get there. If we do, that's great. It'll be publicly disclosed. If we don't, then we move on and we try something else. But what we're looking for is we spend a lot of time trying to understand the businesses and building up a sense of the value, not just of the company in its entirety, but of its constituent parts. The reason that's important is that we subscribe to the notion that pretty much every asset has a natural owner, someone who really is best off owning that company. Now, sometimes a good company will be the natural owner of its own assets, but then sometimes you find that they've got something where there are disparate portfolios that have been put together over the years, particularly with companies that have undergone acquisitions or acquisitions that haven't worked. And what we try and understand is the value of the constituent parts. We always try and do what we call a scorched earth valuation approach, which is to work out what's our real downside. And the scorched earth is often just a theoretical exercise of what would happen in a fire sale. Would we likely get something back? But it helps us to think about those things. And then we also begin to think about how the constituent parts might be worth to other people, to the natural owners. Does that make a bit of sense?
It's fascinating. Yeah. Look, I could sit all day and find out what you do there at Sandon Capital, but I would like to talk about Future Generation. So why do you manage money pro bono for Future Gen?
Well, it was an easy call. If I go for the really simplistic view, Jeff Wilson asked.
Yeah.
So when Jeff asks, for those of you who know Jeff, when Jeff asks you something, it's something you give serious consideration to. Then when he explained what he was looking to do, that made it even easier. I had the good fortune of being involved with Future Gen before it became Future Gen. So we were able to help, in a small way, contribute to the liberation of what was known as the Australian Infrastructure Fund, using activist techniques to then make it Future Gen. So that's how far back I go. It was a small contribution, but it was good to be involved. And then once the charitable approach started taking shape, it just became a no-brainer.
Mm-hmm. So you see the value in it as to the good that it's doing in the world?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of demands on people's time, on their efforts, on money. And I think for me, I've never really had a particular focus on philanthropy. I'm not in that league personally, but doing something through Future Gen, I've got the resources of a professional team with the Future Gen team who help work out the charities and all of those sorts of things. And so for us, the money that we forego, because effectively we're providing our asset management services for free, we rebate all the money, we know that it's going to places that make a difference.